The story of Runeterra is a fascinating one, both within its own fictional universe and without. Though League primarily caters to the competitive audience, more and more people over the years have grown attached to this rich realm and the characters that inhabit it. However, the Runeterra we know today is not the one we started with, and it will likely change even more in the future. League's world has gone through more retcons than I think most people can even count. And to truly appreciate what is, I think it's important to look back at what was. Hello and welcome to Runeterra Recollections, in which we'll be attempting to document the history of League's lore, how it's evolved over the years, and how different characters and story elements have evolved with time. With all that being said, let us begin, shall we? Runeterra as we know it now is a far cry from what we started with. This is the current map of League's world. And this is the map of the old world. Quite a shocker, right? Once upon a time, the story of this game was confined to a single, relatively small continent with a couple of even smaller islands scattered about. And instead of whole countries, the majority of the land was taken up by city-states. Most of the major territory names remain the same, though. The Freljord, Shurima, Demacia, Noxus, Piltover, Zaun, Ionia, the Shadow Isles, Bilgewater, Targon, and Bandle City. These are more or less all the same names that exist on the current map, with the exception of Ishtal, which we'll get to much later, as I believe every nation deserves its own video later down the line. For now, though, let's give a general rundown of each land as it existed in the old incarnation compared to the new one. The Freljord is more or less exactly the same as it once was, a tundra divided by warring tribes. Initially, the Avarosan and the Winter's Claw were the only two tribes of significance, though Lysandra would come in to introduce the Frostguard later on. At this point in time, there were no spirit gods to speak of, though there were shamans who could commune with some kind of spiritual power. Also, no one seemed to wear much clothing in the tundra, though that still kind of persists in modern Runeterra, so not much to discuss there. Next is Demacia, the unequivocally good faction. Most fans of the modern lore will know Demacia as a land of strict traditions and principles, primary among them being the fear and hatred of magic. You probably know about the persecution of mages and their uprising, as well as the reliance on Petricite to stifle them. Well, you can basically toss that all away because old Demacia was nothing like that. People like Lux were allowed to practice magic openly, and the only kind of spellcraft that was looked down upon was anything that could fall under the nebulous and broad category of the dark arts. Old Demacia was a lot less nuanced than it is now. Basically, everyone there was a good guy, and the general aesthetic told you all you really needed to know. By contrast, Noxus was even more morally dubious than it is now, if you can believe it. They've always been a conquering empire, but I mean, old Noxus was built on a mountain with a giant skull carved into it. I feel like that should tell you all you need to know. Still, they've always been something of a meritocracy with the phrase strength above all at the core of their nation, even if that means leaving anyone they don't consider strong in the dust. Unlike Demacia, they promoted the use of any and all means necessary to rise up through society, including the dark arts. In a way, the only truly major change in current Noxus is that they finally have a unified aesthetic. Piltover and Zaun are an interesting case. Believe it or not, they actually used to be two completely separate cities, and they were basically Demacia and Noxus 2.0. Piltover was a futuristic sci-fi city that, while not quite a utopia, definitely presented itself as one with its focus toward progress and innovation. Opposite of them was Zaun, a nation of pollution, toxic runoff, and inhumane experiments. If you think Zon in the current lore is a bad place to live, the concept of the sun might as well not have existed for those who lived in the old city of Kimtek. Needless to say, a lot of the general aesthetics have stayed the same, but the class division between the upper city and lower city has added an interesting new dynamic compared to just good science and bad science. Ionia is probably the region that's undergone the least changes since its inception. It is, and always has effectively been, mystical Asia land, which is a little ironic given that Ionia was technically a part of Greece in real life, but that's a discussion for another time. In League, Ionia embodies a lot of tropes and aesthetics seen in ancient Japan and China, with maybe a little bit of India sprinkled in if you look closely. Beyond that, the general themes of this region remain the same: a pacifist nation whose peace was disrupted by the Noxian invasion. If anything, the new lore leans further into the idea that Ionia has been divided by this war, split between those who want to preserve traditions and others who want to advance Ionia's military and technology in preparation for possible future conflicts. The Shadow Isles are another interesting case. They've more or less always had the same backstory, but it was much vaguer in the earlier days of League. A grief-stricken king trapped the land in undeath by trying to revive his dead queen. Details like the names of these tragic royals, the actual process of this failed resurrection, or even the place's name before becoming the Shadow Isles were all left in the dark. If anything, the modern lore is just answering roughly a decade's worth of questions from the old universe, though whether or not those answers are satisfactory may vary per person. Regardless, the Isles have always been the land of the undead, hostile to the realm of the living. Bilgewater is another nation that's more or less the same as it's always been, a city of pirates and criminals seeking refuge from the arm of any traditional law or government. If anything, Bilgewater actually used to be even more lawless. While Gangplank and Misfortune are both vying to become its monarch now, the old lore painted them as just another pair of pirates. Also, the idea of there being an indigenous people in the form of the Baru hadn't been established until Alawi came along. But other than those details, Bilgewater has been Runeterra's pirate region since its beginning. Now, Targon is a region that has changed quite heavily since its inception. Beyond being vaguely inspired by ancient Greece, it didn't really have much of an identifying or unifying aesthetic. The fact that Leona, Diana, and Pantheon were the region's only champions for many years did not help. Hell, even the idea of the aspects were quite mundane compared to what it is now. Diana and Leona were literally the only ones, and it was extremely vague what the actual source of their power was. Beyond the sun and moon having a vaguely implied sentience, the only other connection we had to the celestial realm for the longest time was Soraka, and her place of residence has been shifted around on more than one occasion. Hell, even Targon's location on the map has changed, so it's quite different from what it once was. Shurima, likewise, has undergone significant changes from its original inception. Though in all fairness, there wasn't much to discuss with Shurima in the old lore either. The most we had in terms of artwork was a couple of floating pyramids, which sounds a lot cooler than it actually was. On top of that, the only champions from the region for a long time were Malzahar, Amumu, and Zareth, the latter painting a picture of a desert nation, consisting almost entirely of scholars and mages, which fell because of Zareth's ascension. That would become the basis for the Shurima we know today, but the region really didn't have much going on until the introduction of the sun disk. However, I would say that no region has changed quite as drastically as Bandle City. Originally, Bandle City was just that, a city where Yordles resided. It was a physical place that you could go to on the map, and Yordles were considered just another race commonly found around Runeterra. The most interesting thing about the old Bandle was that it was built around something called the Mothership, a mysterious spacecraft of unknown origin. This had a lot of implications, but we never quite got the answers to these because Yordles were retconned into these kinda sorta fairy creatures, and Bandle was changed into a place located in the spirit realm. Everything about the region was overhauled from the ground up, with precious little remaining of the original Bandle city. So, now that we've discussed all the old regions, let's talk about how they would interact in the old world. See, many of you are probably aware that the game League of Legends isn't really considered canon to its own lore. The fights on Summoner's Rift and Howling Abyss are treated as exaggerated what-if scenarios. This wasn't always the case. In the old lore, the world of Runeterra was nearly torn apart by a series of conflicts called the Rune Wars. These battles were so utterly devastating that they left the world on the brink of complete destruction, and so a group of mages came together to ensure that another Rune War would never happen again. These mages specialized in summoning magic, and used their expertise to invent a game. In this game, they would summon warriors to compete in combat, but the battles were never truly fatal. See, as long as a summoner remained connected to their warrior or entity of choice, they shared a life force. In other words, so long as the summoners themselves were unscathed, the people or entities they were linked with could be resurrected effectively. This is what we call in-game as respawning. Thus began the Institute of War and the establishment of the League of Legends. The idea was simple. Whenever political conflicts of any sort arose, nations would send their best warriors and mages to compete as champions in these games. If there was a territorial dispute, then the winner of the game got to lay claim to the land. If anyone started fighting over resources, then they'd be distributed primarily to the victor. Yes, the game League of Legends itself was an in-universe way to resolve conflicts between factions without ever escalating to full-on warfare. And you, the player, were a summoner participating in a political debate every time you logged in. It was a very unique premise, and as more and more nations began to abide by the League's rules and restrictions, the Institute's power and influence grew. They became Valorant's ultimate moderator, and the summoners themselves even managed to enlist the aid of certain champions like Ryze and Zillion in enforcing their rules. However, as time passed, the League also began to take on unsavory characters within its ranks. Monsters like Cho'Gath, Nocturne, and Fiddlesticks appeared, and rather than killing or executing them, the summoners chose instead to imprison them and force these monsters to fight in league matches on occasion. To be fair, it is explained that they did this as a means to study and monitor the creatures, but it was a little suspicious. The summoners became even more suspicious when they started taking individuals like Lysandra and Jinx into their ranks. See, the summoners had a rule that champions were not allowed to fight or kill each other outside of battles, regardless of whatever personal vendettas some of them may have harbored. While this was a hindrance to some, it also gave others something akin to diplomatic immunity. Champions were closely monitored, and if it was found that they ever broke this rule, then summoners would swiftly step in and break up the fight. The one exception is the time Warwick killed Urf in an ambush, but every other conflict was quickly brought to a halt before it could even begin. And really, I think this is where the primary issue of the old lore started to show itself. The summoners simply became too powerful, forcing every possible storyline and conflict into a stalemate. Jinx could never truly be caught and arrested for her crimes because she was a champion, even if the summoners did what they could to rein her in. Lysandra, despite harboring clearly malicious goals, could not be interfered with by anyone but the summoners. Rengar and Kha'Zix could never definitively settle their hunt because the summoners forbade it. Hell, even when Demacia and Noxus tried to go to war over rare resource deposits in Kalamandra, against the League's wishes, The summoners stepped in with the help of Zillion to freeze both armies in a time bubble. Ultimately, no stories could really advance unless the Institute of War lost control of its massive roster of champions. But then that would directly contradict itself with the game, your game, in which every match only reinforces the idea that the summoners are still in control. So, ultimately, a decision was made. If the lore was being held back by its most fundamental aspect, then what else could be done but reboot the whole thing? Remake Runeterra from the ground up, remove the summoners from the canon, and re-establish where every single champion fits into this new world. It was a controversial decision, to be sure, and resulted in no small amount of backlash from the fans. So many stories, so many iconic moments and events, gone. I myself was quite bitter about these changes for a long time, but over the years, as Riot has slowly but surely reinvented Runeterra, I believe it was the right decision. The map has been vastly expanded, conflicts and arcs are allowed to progress in ways that never could have happened with the summoner's interference, and our champions are allowed to interact with each other however they please. Of course, it's not ideal. The Runeterra we have now still suffers from a sort of status quo. Even without any in-universe reason for it, champions effectively still maintain a level of plot armor that keeps them from ever truly dying. After all, every character is someone's favorite, and even if the game is no longer canon to its own story, how would you feel about your main being killed off? It's a topic that warrants further discussion in its own video, I think, but even if the restrictions aren't fully alleviated, there's no denying that the writers have much more creative freedom now that the Institute of War isn't looming over every single plotline. After all, it's hard to have conflict in a story that revolves around an organization dedicated to preventing conflict. While the idea of a political game used to settle disputes in place of actual war is a unique idea, it just didn't lend itself well to a story designed to theoretically continue on forever. While not every change in the new lore has been handled with the greatest degree of tact, I think we can generally agree that a lot of good has come out over the last several years. Even so, I think it's worth remembering what this world once was. In spite of its flaws, the old Runeterra still gave us some great stories and interactions between champions who, without the Institute serving as a central hub, have never even heard of each other in the current canon. But I think that about does it for this video. What do you all think? Do you prefer the new lore, or do you still long for the days of the Institute? Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and join me next time as we dive into the history of the champions themselves. Bye for now.